Hi, I'm Una. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to share with you all of my 2024 reading stats. I have a lot of them. This year I kept track of my reading through both Goodreads and Storygraph, as well as a reading spreadsheet. I used the one that Covers with Cassidy made and put up last year. I think she's made a couple changes to it for 2025. But that's the one I used. So it tracked a lot of things, including things like publishers, which I haven't seen a lot of other things track. She has her own rating system, which I kind of used, although it would sometimes, adjust things for my own judgment. The thing to note about that is that the rating system is heavily biased, or at least somewhat biased in terms of enjoyment over other factors, but it's kind of similar to Cawpile, and it generates a lot of wonderful graphs for you. So I'm gonna go through some of those, as well as some from Storygraph. So I'm gonna be looking down a little bit at my computer screen, which is just right down here, and I will make sure to have some space over here to put up some graphs. So, okay, the cat wanted to leave, so I had to let him go. So anyway, so my overall stats. I read 300 books this year, and I feel like I need to say something about that. I feel like there's a lot of discourse going on about people who read lots of books and people who skim books and all this sort of stuff. And I just want to say, just from where I'm coming from, this year reading was like my primary, if not only, hobby. And that is why I read so many books. I, especially towards the beginning of the year, was just feeling obsessively that I really wanted to be reading all of the time. So I was reading every moment that I had to be reading, every moment that I wasn't in class or doing homework or, hanging out with friends, I was reading. And it's a lot of books. I don't think I will read this many books in a year ever again, unless, a similar thing happened. It's not my goal to make anyone feel like they need to read this number of books or that this is like a normal attainable number of books to read. This does also include comic volumes, graphic novels, a couple of short stories. This is just my experience of this year. I don't skim books. I don't only read dialogue. That's not the only way that someone can possibly read 300 books in a year. Obviously, there are people that do that, and I'm kind of different about it. If that's like the way that you prefer to consume books, whatever. But I don't. I did listen to a lot of audiobooks, so I'll get into that. I read around 61,800 pages, and I listened to around 1,030 hours of audio, which at my average reading speed or listening speed is probably around 740 hours real time, which is about 170 pages and 2.8 hours, or around 2 hours in real time per day. So yeah, that is a lot, but I read pretty quickly, so 170 pages is like 2.5 hours of reading per day maybe, which fluctuates a lot day to day. I read a lot on the weekends. I don't work on Saturdays at all, even like housework, so I spend a lot of my time reading on Saturdays. I listen to a lot of audiobooks while I'm working or biking or walking, doing puzzles, whatever it may be. So those are like very achievable numbers for the way my life has been the past year. Even when I was a full-time student and partially employed, I was still reading a couple hundred pages per day, listening to a couple hours of audiobook per day, just depending on what I had going on. It wasn't that challenging for me because I was so focused on my reading. So anyway, that is hopefully out of the way. Those are my overall stats. My average pages per book was around 307 or 308 pages per book. I feel pretty happy about that, especially considering the amount of comic volumes and short stories and novellas in this collection of things. I will get into that a little bit later. I'm gonna start with basically just the books read and pages read per month. So here are the amount of books read per month. As you can see, I averaged around 20 to 25 books per month. March is the big outlier. I was doing Realmathon in March, which was my first real readathon, first team-based competitive readathon, so I was really feeling the competitive spirit, and I ended up basically going into my Goodreads to read list and finding a lot of comics and graphic novels and things that had blue covers, because that was how I got bonus points, that had been on my digital TBR for a really long time. So I got a bunch of things from the library and also some really short like audiobooks and read a lot of those. So I did read 39 books in March. A lot of those were comic volumes. The cat wants back in. So like for context, in March, the average page count was only 266 pages per book. Okay, back to my overall monthly stats. My lowest month was July with 19 books. No, I had just moved. Anyway, I didn't read as many books. Some like notes. I saw someone else do stats of different format per month, which I thought was cool. So I thought I'd add a little notes about those trends. So January was my highest ebook month because I had just gotten really into using Libby in December. And so I had a lot of ebooks that were coming in on hold, and I was reading on my e-reader, and I wasn't really used to going to the library physically where I used to live. And then my ebooks peaked again in June and July. July, which is when I had moved and I again wasn't really in the habit of going to the library here. Now I am. I go like twice a week. March was my highest audiobook month with 10 audiobooks. Again, I was just reading a lot of books in March for Realmathon. I didn't necessarily have a lot of free time. Again, I was a full-time college student. I read some shorter audiobooks, but my audiobook listening did hover around 8 books per month for the first 6 months and then went down to about 6 for the last 6 months, with a low of 4 in September. And the cat was trying to chew on my lights. Okay. And one just kind of funny note is that I pretty consistently read one book, both audio and physical or ebook, every month, like just one every month. I think 1 month I had 0, 1 month I had 2, so that was pretty consistent. That's something I do want to do, not necessarily more, but that I want to keep in mind as an option for when I'm figuring out how I want to read a book. In October and March, those were my 2 top highest physical books, where I read a lot of books from the library, 19 books in each of those months. And then just I wanted to touch on some of the readathons I did, because I was thinking back in my goals video, I was like really off with the amount. So in 2024, I did 5 team-based competitive readathons and I won 2 of them, which I was really, or like my team won 2 of them, which was I was really proud of. And then I did 4 readathons that were like kind of a go at your own pace TBR based thing with like a bingo board or a game board, which were really fun too. And I completed 120 Storygraph challenges, which is crazy a little bit. I was doing a lot of like monthly like bingo boards, monthly prompts, like where you have like 5 prompts for the month, and then I do like 3 of those per month and just see what I could match things to, as well as a couple seasonal challenges, a couple like cover-based challenges. I was having a lot of fun. I'm trying to like rein it in. I was just like joining challenges all around. Some like representation challenges or like diversity challenges. Anyway, in terms of pages per month, I think you can see some of the trends I was talking about. March was a lot of pages. June and July were a lot less, as was September. I was reading a lot of short things in September, so that's why there's a difference there. I was averaging around 7,000 to 8,000 pages per month. Also, in terms of month breakdown, here's the Storygraph kind of minutes and books and pages graph. So you can see like January I read a lot more pages, a lot fewer minutes, and then February I was listening to a lot more. March I was reading a lot of short books, so the book is on the top. May, June, and July, like audiobooks were really carrying me, especially in June when I was not reading a ton of pages, whereas September audiobooks completely kind of fell off and pages were on top. And then they kind of evened out by the end of the year. Just a little interesting to see those trends. In terms of genres, so I read from 19 different genres that I tracked in this sheet. So I will show like my genre wheel, what I count as my top genres. I feel like the genres on Storygraph get a little biased by things that aren't completely like genres. So my top genre was undoubtedly fantasy. I read 77 books. I categorized as fantasy. Storygraph counted 117 books that had at least some aspect of fantasy. The next one on Storygraph is LGBT, which I don't track as a genre, I track that as representation. So the next one in my spreadsheet is romance, which I think is interesting because I don't think of myself as a romance reader, but I was definitely reading a decent amount of romance this year. And then mystery, whereas on Storygraph, it's LGBT, then romance, again. So Storygraph tracked 69 romances, whereas I only tracked 33. And then young adult on Storygraph, which I didn't track age categories this year, but Storygraph tracked 62 young adult books. And then contemporary again, not always. Sometimes that's the setting more than the genre. Sometimes it's more the genre. And then I think mystery was probably after that. But I tracked fantasy, then romance, then 29 mysteries, then I believe is fantasy romance, and then nonfiction. I would say I'm still working on like my own genre categorizations. There were some genres I added where I wasn't really sure how it would work out, like speculative. I'm still kind of figuring out what's speculative, what's sci-fi, what's magical realism, like how those best work. I had true crime as a genre, but then I only read 1 book in it. This cat cannot decide where he wants to be. Anyway, I will say my genre with the most 5 stars was fantasy, but that is just because I read so many fantasies. So like I saw that happening and then I decided to calculate my genre 5-star percent. So how many 5 stars out of the amount of books that I read in that genre. My 5-star percent in fantasy is actually only 20%, so only 1 in 5 fantasy books that I read is a 5-star. And actually the highest in this category is nonfiction, where I have a 50% 5-star rating. Half of the nonfiction books I read this year I gave 5 stars. And then some other top categories, classics, which is around 37% of the classics I read I gave a 5-star, and sci-fi, again around 40%, 38%, as well as memoir. So those are some of my like most liked genres. Some notable really low genres. I didn't give any essay collections 5 stars. I think it's really hard to give an essay collection 5 stars. Thrillers have a really low 5-star percent with only 16%. Mystery is only 13%. as is fantasy romance, and the lowest with any 5 stars is romance, which is a 30% 5 star. So that gives you a very different picture from like just the plain genres. Next, we're gonna look at the sizes of the book I read. I split this up a little differently than Storygraph does. So according to my count, I read 45 books that were teeny, like under 150 pages. I read 71 books that were small, so like between 150 and 300 pages. 163 books that were medium, which is like 300 to 500 pages. 18 books that were large, so around 500 to 700 pages. And then 3 books that were like chunky, like way over that amount. I feel pretty good with this. I think medium is like my sweet spot. It's where I like to be. Small books are easy to read, so I think that can inflate their numbers. But I also, some of my favorite books have been really small. In terms of teeny tiny books, it's really hit or miss for me. I feel like either a lot of times I feel like I don't have enough time to get really invested in it, but sometimes I really end up liking them. And then I would like to read more large books next year, but I don't want to stress myself out with it too much. Next, I'm going to look at the publication date. I kept really detailed track of this. This is something I really changed about this spreadsheet. I was really curious about the publication date, but I split it into kind of bin categories of decade, and then I got more and more specific the closer we got to today's date. So I counted 2024, 2023, and 2022 separately, and then I put together 2020 and 2021, and then I divided the 2010s into 2 halves, and then everything else is a decade. And I thought this was interesting. Originally I was keeping it all as decades until the last couple years. Originally, I was keeping it all together, but then I realized that like a lot of my reading was from specifically 2015 to 2019, and I feel like it was close enough to the present that it was interesting. So overall, definitely my biggest, again, still is 2015 to 2019 with 75 books. So a full quarter of my reading was from that span of 5 years. And then that is followed by 2023 with 45 books, and then 2024 with 36 books, which I like was not expecting at the beginning of this year. I really thought I would keep more to like probably the past 6 years, and I wouldn't read that many new releases. I didn't really think that that was who I was as a reader, but those kind of changed throughout the months. So definitely my top decades are basically since the 2000s. I have a decent amount. I read 27 books published in the 2000s, 19 books 2010 to 2014, 34 books 2020 to 2021, 32 books from 2022, 45 from 2023, 36. Like those are my biggest chunks. And then mostly the other decades that I tracked had 1 or 2 books. So like I read Pride and Prejudice, so I have 1 book from the 1810s. I did read 2 books from the 1970s, 7 from the 1980s, 3 from the 1950s, 8 from the 1990s, and 3 from the 1960s. So I'm pretty happy with that. I like to have a little bit of like, you know, year diversity, and I do care about when these books are coming from. It shows me like how many classics I'm reading and what time periods, what I'm thinking about. Definitely some of this was motivated by like Old School April and challenges like that, which I think can be a lot of fun. And if I look at this by quarter, you can see that my largest category for the first 2 quarters was 2015 to 2019, but then my largest category for the last 2 quarters was 2024. Well, I think one was 2015 to 2019, one was 2024, but like they were getting a lot more even. And I think this comes to like what was exciting me about books in these quarters. So like for the first half of the year, when I was really just like getting back into being a voracious reader, I never really stopped reading, but reading a lot more. I was reading a lot of the books that I was really excited about that were already on my list, that I had heard about from friends or from whatever from the years before. So I was reading a lot of those books that came out that I would have been reading if I had been reading more in high school and then in the first couple years of college. It's raining outside. Oh, whoa. But then by the kind of second half of the year, more of the books that I was excited about were books I was hearing about on BookTube, which are not always new releases, but in this case were. And also a lot more of my like, you know, there were a lot more books that had been released this year to pick from. A lot more of my library holds on new releases were coming through, and I did start a NetGalley, which did add probably 12 books to that number, so that definitely helped. Next, we're looking at the format I read them in, which I already talked a little bit about, but just overall, I read 118, 40% of my books physically, 91 or 30% of my books audio, and 78 or 26% as an ebook, and again 13, so just about 1 per month mixed media, which is usually audio and ebook or audio and physical. Towards the beginning of the year, it was really heavily weighted in favor of ebooks because I was reading a lot more ebooks, and then I started going to the library, and then basically everything I would have gotten as ebook I was getting from the library. I do find ebooks to be helpful sometimes. I haven't quite decided if I like them. I think I like ebooks for longer books because they don't can't see the size of it, just the progress bar, which can sometimes be nice, but sometimes it's demoralizing. I do really like audiobooks, but I think this year I will be listening to fewer because I'm going to be doing more podcast listening, hopefully, and that fills some of the same space. I'm happy with this distribution of things. In terms of how I acquired these books, I thought this was really interesting. As you can see, there's no majority, but the plurality are from Libby. I was using Libby a lot, and because I used it for both ebooks and audiobooks, kind of got double the use that any other category could. After that is the library. So 45% or 135 from Libby, and then 87 or 29% from the library. I feel really great about both of those numbers. And then the next largest category is actually owned, which is 34 books. I think this is right. I think one of them I do own, but I didn't read it. The owned copy, I ended up having to get some books that I do own somewhere else from the library because I moved and such. And then from Hoopla, which is 22%. This went up and down a lot, like kind of depending on whether or not I was like using Hoopla a lot and remembering to go look there. Now he's trying to paw at all my stuff. I really like Hoopla. I'm really grateful I have access to it. And I was trying recently, I was going back and looking, refreshing my Hoopla likes to remember what's on there. And then after that, 12 from NetGalley, 7 from KU, which actually kind of surprised me. I did have KU for like 2 months this year, and then 3 I borrowed from friends, which I really appreciate. A lot of these books here are borrowed from friends, and that's a great resource that I have. I have bookish friends that are willing to share their books with me, and I want to use that a lot more in the next year. And then this is like the format. This is not the format in terms of like digital, but like what kind of book was it? So most of my reading is novels, which doesn't surprise me. 65%, 195 books were novels, and then 21 books were like non-fiction books, like novel size, but they're not a novel, they're non-fiction. Okay. So it was 21, 7%. 24 were novellas, 6%, 19 were comic volumes, 6%, 18 were graphic novels, and then I have some short stories, some essay collections, some manga, picture books, and short story collections. So those are kind of like the little bits are all about 1% of my reading. I just thought that was interesting in terms of like knowing what it means for me to have read 300 books or 300 things I tracked this year. It's interesting to know these numbers. Now we're gonna get into something that's kind of complicated, which is publishing. So people talk a lot about the big 5 in publishing, and that's something I was really curious about. Like, am I reading mostly from the big 5? Cassie's spreadsheet, thankfully, I'm really grateful. She put together this huge list of parent publishers and imprints and publishers and which ones are owned by the big 5. And then whenever I read a book that wasn't already in that list, I tried to add it, and to the best of my knowledge, if it was owned by one of the big 5, put it in that category. If not, sometimes I ended up reading from 2 different publishers that were owned by another publisher that didn't seem to be part of the big 5. So I did my best to track it. It ended up getting kind of confusing, and I'm working on revamping it for next year. But basically, I did read 103 books not from the big 5 as far as I could tell. And not all of these, I didn't feel comfortable putting all of these into like, I think some people do like big 5 indie published, self-published, but a lot of them didn't seem like indie to me. Like, they were independent and that they're not owned by the big 5, but they were owned by like big corporations. Some of them were, for example, like a company that's really big in Japan but doesn't publish a lot in English or in the US. Some like comic publishers that didn't seem like they were owned by anyone in the big 5. I could be really wrong about this, but what I tracked basically was 103 books of my 300 books not published by big 5 publishers, which makes me feel good, you know, about a third. 34 of those are from indie publishers and 9 were self-published, and then the rest were a medium-sized publisher that I don't think was owned by the big 5 as far as I could tell. In terms of like individual publishers and who I read the most, I did keep track of this, and my top ones were all audiobook publishers, which makes sense because I think that's a little bit more centralized in terms of publishing. My top singular publisher was Macmillan Audio with 17, followed by Penguin Random House Audio with 14, and then Harper Audio was also coming in at 9. I think I had another one. Simon & Schuster Audio had 8. My other largest publishers were Del Rey with 9, self-published, which I counted as 1, which was also 9, Tor with 7, Headshot Audio was also 7, Boombox, and Image Comics, which again were kind of comic series, and then Little Brown and Company. Okay, let's move on from that. It's a little bit boring. Next, we're gonna look at my star rating breakdown. This was a pie chart, and then I switched it to this because I don't know, it looked a little clearer. You can see the different sizes, but it's all one color, which I don't love. But anyway, you can see that largest category is 4 stars with 145, then 3 stars with 80, 5 stars with 63, 2 stars with 8, and 1 star with 1. So this varies a little bit depending on the platform. Again, this is based on Cassie's calculation, which does favor enjoyment over others, and it's one of the calculations where you like break it down, so it's really hard to give like a true 1 star. Like, it's really rare that in a book that you don't like everything about it is absolutely horrible. But I do think this gives a good overall impression. I can also look at my story graph reading thing, which has more variety. You can see, again, I have around 65 stars, far less 3 stars, and then just a couple 2 stars and 1 stars. In general, I think I had a good reading year. I want to get better at DNFing some of those 3-star books, the ones that are just like not interesting, and some of those 2-star books, although that might be a little harder. I think I also want to kind of rate less in 2025. I want to like just allow myself to have complicated feelings without worrying about what star rating I'm going to give it. I feel like sometimes I was like thinking about that while I was reading the book. I don't like that. So yeah, I've already started doing that. I think of the books that I've tracked this year, I haven't rated like 4 of them, which is about half. So I'm fine with that. Or I'm not going to worry about like I'm using a Cawpile sheet this year. So like I'm not going to worry about like making it fit Cawpile because it doesn't fit everything. And I can just do my own rating based off of how I feel. Now we're going to look at series versus standalone. This is another thing I changed. So originally it was just series versus standalone, but I feel like there's a big difference between a narrative series, like a fantasy series or a sci-fi series that has an overarching narrative, and like a mystery series where each book is self-contained, it has its own mystery, and then you can continue with those characters. Maybe there's a bit of an overarching plot, maybe there isn't. Maybe you could start anywhere in the series. I feel like those are very different to me. So I separated them. So 55% of my reading, or 165 books, were complete standalones, not part of a series, not connected to anything else. 89 or 30% of my reading were in a series, a narrative series with a plot line, things are happening, you have to keep reading. And then 46 or 15% were in a companion series. So this is like Poirot or any other mystery series, a romance series like the Abby Jimenez series. That's a companion series, right? Like they don't really affect the plot of each other. And I thought that was interesting, and I'm really curious if that will change next year. I kind of want to work on more series next year, so I guess we'll see. I started 82 series. I finished 6, 2 of which were rereads, and I DNF'd 37. So this didn't calculate well for me, like what that actually means, but I did start a series tracker with about 30 or 35 series on it for next year, and I'm curious to see how that will go. I did start a lot of series. I did also continue a decent amount of them, but I definitely have some work to do. In terms of author gender, I thought this was interesting to track. I overwhelmingly read from women. 187 books were written by a single woman. A lot of books were also written by multiple women, so that counts as my multiple category of 27. I'm tracking this in a little bit more of a detailed way next year. 69 or 23% were written by men, and then 17 or 5 to 6% were written by non-binary or otherwise like gender non-conforming, out of these categories people, which I'm pretty happy with. I think this makes sense. Women are a large part of the publishing industry. I'm a woman. I often want women characters, good women characters in my books, but it's not something I worry too much about. Okay, so 26.5% of the books I read were written by authors of color, which I'm pretty happy with. I think it would be great to get it up to a third next year, but we'll see. Pretty much half, this is 49.17%, but basically half of the books I read had some kind of LGBT representation in this. I didn't always count if this was just like a one-off mention of a side character being LGBT in some way. Generally, I tried to count like an actual main character, primary side character in the book was LGBT or was just really dealing with LGBT issues. So I'm really happy with that. I mean, I'd love to get it higher, but that's just the publishing world. And then in terms of rereads, 4% of my reading was rereads. I reread 16 books this year, which is a very small proportion, but I think probably a typical number. We'll see. I love rereading, and I think especially with working on series next year, I will have to be rereading some of the first and maybe even second books in those series to keep going. And then the last thing I have here is if I had read the author before. So 173 or 60%. Okay. 60% or 173 books out of the 300 were from new to me authors. 14% or 44 of them were from recent debut authors, so authors that only had 1 book or maybe 2. I was kind of a little it was a little sketchy with how I counted this. And then 83 books or 28% of my reading was authors I had read before. Okay, I think I also included, I thought this little detail from Storygraph was fun, that August was my month with the highest average rating of the books that I did input to Storygraph. Sometimes I missed some in terms of adding the rating. July was my lowest with a 3.88 rating, so I had pretty good months overall. And March, obviously, I read the most pages, so we all know that. I believe that's everything I have for you. I think I've done a good amount of reflecting on 2024. Again, like everybody is different. Everyone reads a different amount. Everyone has a different life that allows them different amounts of time to spend reading. I have had a year that has allowed me to spend a lot of time reading this year, and I've just prioritized it a lot, which definitely helps in terms of finding the time. For next year, I'm going to be using the spreadsheet from G at Book Roast and adapting it to suit my preferences. So I am adding stuff about publication because now I'm like so curious. I like that it includes the dates that you've read things, The DNFs, I'm trying to check my DNFs better. I did DNF. Okay, one source says 14 and one says 21. So somewhere in there, some books I counted that I definitely DNF'd a couple of years ago and just have only really made peace with the fact that they're DNFs this year. G's spreadsheet, which is Pile, also tracks nationality. And I started adding, because I was just curious, but like season, if there's a specific season it takes place in, or that it has like seasonal vibes, because I, again, love rereading books. And now that I live in places that with seasonal weather, I didn't grow up with seasonal weather, but I like rereading books in the specific season I'm in, and it's really easy for me to forget and then like start reading the book and be like, oh yeah, this is set in fall and it's, you know, January. So I'm tracking the season if there is one, which has been really fun. And then like the book length things are a little bit different. There's a subgenre and an age category, and I'm excited to see how those go. I did change my year categories a little bit too. Oh, and cover color. Oh my gosh, I almost forgot. Then we can end on cover color because I thought this was really fun. So here's my cover color breakdown. As you can see, the huge winner was blue with 79. Now this definitely got a huge boost from Ramathon because I was reading books with blue covers to get extra points. But again, I only read 40 books during Realmathon, and not all of them had blue covers. So I would say maybe 30 of these were from Realmathon, and it still has the most. So many books just have blue covers. I'm really curious what this will be next year, if I'll do Realmathon again, and if so, which team. I won't do blue again, because I think it'll be interesting to see if blue still has like a really strong presence. But yeah, after blue is black with 43, then multicolored. So this is when there just like really isn't a primary color with 29 or 9%. Then we have, I think, green with 22 or 7%, and then red with 19 or 6%. Then brown, beige, gray, purple, and then our lowest are yellow and pink and orange. So we'll see. I was thinking red books one month, just look for the short books with red covers on my TBR that I can just like motivate myself to read in that month. It's just like a fun way to read books that I might not otherwise have picked up at that time, you know? There's my cover color graph. I'm definitely keeping track of this next year because I think it's so much fun. And so far this year, I guess I had 3 blue and 2 black and 2 yellow and 2 pink. So it's very colorful this year so far. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this video is not super long. I apologize for the cat and car interruptions if you noticed them. Hopefully you didn't. Hopefully I edited it super smooth. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for joining me on this channel, on my journey of starting this channel this year, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Bye!